Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, March 1938, two precocious young boys from Cleveland, Ohio, Jerome Siegel and Joe Shuster, have a check burning a hole in their pocket. That check is for $130, which is almost $3,000 in today's money, which is not that bad. And the check is from DC Comics for the rights to a comic book character that they had created, Superman. Whoops. I don't have to tell you that giving away the rights to Superman for $130 ended up being a bit of a mistake. One incredible fact in this whole story, the check itself, like the paper check, the thing that was written, $130 on it, that piece of paper sold for $160,000 in 2012, which is my favorite tidbit from this whole story. But let's talk about this great moment in intellectual property negotiations and even beyond IP, or maybe related to it, this larger question of what Superman represented in 1938, what he represents now, and how he's reflected our culture and politics in the many decades in between. There is no better person to do that with than today's special guest, Glen Weldon, author of Superman, the Unauthorized Biography, and you may know him as one of the hosts of NPR's Pop Culture Happy Hour podcast and many other great things on NPR and beyond. So Glen, welcome to the show. It's a real honor to have you on.
Oh, heck, it's an honor to be on. Thanks, Jody.
And of course, with us, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Glen, let's go to that moment, 1938. But actually, I should say, you wrote your book 10 years ago. Does it feel like 10 years ago?
You wrote your book really does.
10 years. Yeah. You wrote your book 10 years ago on the 75th anniversary. So here we are on the 85th anniversary, 1938, 85 years ago. But I gather that in the years before that, in the years up to this sale, Siegel and Shuster weren't really able to get someone to pay attention to Superman, much less, give them any amount of money for it. So you want to describe kind of like those years where they were creating this now iconic character and maybe not getting much traction?
Sure. I mean, they were getting traction for other characters. I mean, they were at this time in their early 20s, but they weren't rubes. They weren't neophytes. They had already sold characters to what was then called National Allied Publication, now called DC Comics. And they kind of knew the drill. And just to set the table, comics were created as a money grab, as a second bite of the apple for publishers, as an afterthought, because the first comics were just reprints of already existing newspaper comic strips. They were a way for publishers, for publishing syndicates, to make money off of the same IP by just reprinting comics that were already out there in the world and reselling them in a different format. So they were printed on really cheap pulp paper, because that's about how much anybody valued them. Their cheapness, their disposability was the selling point. Junk culture, it was called. Siegel and Shuster had sold strips to DC before, at the exact moment that DC decided they were going to do something unusual and start printing comics with original characters in them, like Slam Bradley, who was one of Siegel and Shuster's original characters, who is this two-fisted detective.
We all have two fists. That's
I know. To be clear, two-fisted detective.
Not impressive.
But what they wanted more than anything else was a newspaper strip, because that's where the money was. It was a much higher bar to clear to get a newspaper strip, but once you did, the odds were very good that you were kind of on easy street, for at least for a while, because the work would be steady, the royalties would be dependable, your readership would go from the thousands to the millions, and also, not for nothing, I think this kind of factored in, you'd be a household name, like Alex Raymond, who did Flash Gordon, or Al Cap, who did Lil Abner. You'd get a cut of the merchandising, and merchandising was already a thing. There were already Buck Rogers toy ray guns and Little Orphan Annie secret decoder pins, and that was their dream. And they were banking that dream on a character that they had been tweaking together since high school. They met in high school. They bonded over this shared love of science fiction, and they self-published this magazine in high school, basically the first fanzine, or one of the first fanzines. And in one issue, Siegel wrote this story called Reign of the Superman, which is about this vagrant who had been injected with elements from a meteor, as you do, and he gained the power of ESP and power of mind control, and he sets out to rule the world. A few months later, they retool that whole character and make the character good guy, who doesn't have mind powers, because, of course, mind powers, intellectualism, that's villain stuff. And in the 30s, a good guy was a strong dude who was impervious to bullets. So really in the mold of like Doc Savage and John Carter of Mars. And not for nothing, I think it's a factor, Popeye, right? Strong, good-hearted dude. So they put together this incredible package to try to sell this character to newspaper syndicates. And the language is just, it's quintessential kind of ad copy language. And I have it here. Hold on. The greatest single event since the birth of comic strips. A strip we sincerely believe will sweep the nation. The super strip of them all. The greatest superhero strip of all time. So a couple things to point out there. A, they weren't wrong. Did sweep the nation. B, that is the first recorded use of the term superhero in this modern sense of the term. And there's a hyphen in it, right? If that matters to people. It does matter to some people. It does matter to me. And it doesn't occur in any story. It's not in the narrative. The first time it happens, it's a marketing term that is being used to sell Superman. Yeah. And it comes from this place of breathless ad copy. It's not a strip, it's a super strip. You know, he's not a hero, he's a superhero. But the other thing that I think is equally important is that they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that merchandising was a selling point to syndicates. So Schuster in this package draws Superman's face on a box of crackers and on undershirts and on model kits. So the character and the sellability of the character, the saleability of the character are created, in tandem, the American way.
And at the bottom of that proposal, actually, they write, and we will sell this character for $131. And then DC Comics, of course, bargains them down to $130. And
I know why they sold it, right? Because,
No, that didn't actually happen.
They loved science fiction more than they loved, these cheesy detective yarns and their spy stories. And they had a hit on their hands. But they, as you mentioned, Jody, they kept getting rejected because the newspaper syndicates called the strip that they were trying to sell too crude, too juvenile. So finally, DC Comics agrees to buy it. But as a comic, they're not a newspaper syndicate. They're a comics company, a periodical company. And they say, we'll buy this just like we bought all your other work. Same deal. But you have to take this presentation, this package, and turn these into 13 comic book pages, which we're going to put into what we call Action Comics #1. That is $10 a page. And one of those pages was a super short kind of origin story. And that's it. They sold the character to DC. And something started happening almost right away. It took them a while because Action Comics #1 was an anthology of 11 different features. Superman was on the cover of Action #1, but there were 10 other stories in there. So it took a while because it was 1938 for the publishers to realize what it was the selling point of the book, why this book was flying off the shelves and others weren't. And so it came down to 7 months later, their sales reps come back to them and say, the kids are asking for the book with Superman in it. So suddenly Superman starts appearing on the cover every time, not just once in a while. So they had to kind of realize, okay, it's not Scoop Scanlon. It's not Sticky Mitts Stimson. It's Superman. And then within a year, Time Magazine is already writing this about it. It's saying, he says, and I love this, Time Magazine says, Superman is fast becoming the #1 juvenile Vogue in the U.S.
Juvenile Vogue?
Juvenile Vogue. Strike a pose. Anyway, so in that first year, you got Superman paper dolls and wooden action figures and paint sets, puzzles and coloring books, and soon you're going to have moccasins, super moccasins, and underwear and swim trunks. And in a year, he gets his own book, Superman, which is just, a series of reprints of Action Comics, at least in the beginning. And then finally, in 1939, they do get their wish. They get a Superman newspaper comic strip with the McClure Syndicate. Then we get a radio show. Then, again, 1939, just a year. It's only been a year.
Yeah.
Public appearance at the New York World's Fair. They dress up this skinny dude in a really ratchet Superman outfit and have a Superman Day. We have the first float in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. A year later, we get the Fleischer animated shorts. And for my money, I think that's what does it. I mean, that's where the real power of this character starts to get its hooks into the public at large. Because the books and even the radio show, that's heard by thousands. These shorts, these animated shorts were seen by millions and millions of people, and they still look great. I don't know if you've seen them. Yeah. They're great storytelling. Mm-hmm. The action is really dynamic, and it's thrilling, and people cheered them, not just kids, but adults, and you can still see why. But then World War II comes along, and everything sort of changes for Superman. But that's the beginning. That's the genesis.
I'm glad you mentioned World War II, because I think that as a political historian, that's where I started the Superman story, right? Those images of him fighting Nazis and getting involved in wars. But as I was reading, I was discovering that some of his earlier enemies were things like people who use child labor and working on like mine safety for workers. So he's kind of this New Deal hero. Is that part of his
It's like
story?
Tom Jones
Yeah.
thing, yeah.
Totally. Yeah, that was very intentional on their part. He gets a one-page origin, and at the bottom of that origin, we see him for the first time in the costume, and the first thing that he's called is Champion of the Oppressed. That's long before Man of Steel, long before Man of Tomorrow, because in those first couple years anyway, he is a progressive reformer, essentially, in a cape. He is basically going after people who are bullies. He is a bully for the bullies. He beats up white beaters. He always will stand up for what we now call marginalized people against the very rich and the very powerful, who are always depicted as corrupt and uncaring. And he's often, especially in the Fleischman shorts, he's also painted in this kind of social realist style, like these posters that you recognize. But what happens as soon as World War II hits is that all of those hard edges, and they were pretty hard because he was, just a kind of a thug, it gets softened and abraded down because now he must become a patriotic symbol. Now he has to be associated with the flag. Now he has to start hawking war bonds and telling people to grow victory gardens and collect scrap metal. And he also becomes a big thing for GIs at the time. Like, they shipped millions and millions of Superman comics overseas for the GIs, and he was their icon. It was Betty Grable, number one, and Superman, number two.
Yeah. I mean, what I love about Superman is sort of like his public persona of a sort of nerdy guy with glasses and sort of unassuming is something that is empowering for like the ultimate underdog story in a way in which people can relate to him as someone who might have gotten bullied or might have grown up poor or without. And then he becomes this, empowered person that people can also grasp onto. Like, he's aspirational in the way that people think of, man, if I had power or if I had this, strength or whatever, this is how I might use it. I mean, his story just works in so many different ways, whether he's Clark Kent or Superman.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing. Like, his whole defining aspect, especially in those early years, is if they only knew, right? If they only knew who I really was, what I can do, but I have to hide it from them. And that's the power. It's one power of the character because, again, those really early comics, long before the 60s come along and Marvel changes the game, those early comics are appealing to kid wish fulfillment, the simplest stuff. I wish I could fly. I want to be the fastest. I want to be the smartest. I want to be the strongest. When the Marvel comes along, we're going to get into a more adolescent phase where I want to be accepted. I want to have a girlfriend. I want to keep my job. Like, these are different concerns. But back then, they were primal. They were very simple, and that's why they're so powerful.
There's also, I think, slip into a little with Siegel and Schuster, a little psychoanalysis on this front, too, where they say, like, well, these guys were kind of nerdy and small, and they were, like, immigrant kids from Cleveland, and so then maybe they had a little bit of a sense of, like, I'm Clark Kent and I wish I could be Superman.
Yeah, I don't think that's a stretch. I really don't think that's a stretch, especially when you consider that Siegel would go on to marry the woman who was the model for Lois Lane that he knew in high school. Like, again, second wife, not first wife, but like, there is an aspirational aspect to this character, and Lois Lane in those first couple of years is drawn as this really aloof, off-putting woman who will not give Clark Kent the time of day.
I'm also curious because he is sort of coming into his popularity during the 1940s. There are these like names for Superman, the Man of Steel, Superman itself, that have these parallels with fascism, with Übermensch and with Stalin. Like, how did that authoritarianism play into or counterbalance Superman?
Well, it always informs him, and certainly, in the 50s, when a guy called Dr. Frederick Wertham came along with a book called Seduction of the Innocent, he made a lot of sweeping statements, and his data was all screwed up, and he was conflating a lot of his data in really bad ways. But as I say in my book, Batman: The Cape Crusade, dude had a point to an extent. Yes, there was injury to the eye motif that was a real thing. And yes, there was a homoerotic subtext to Batman and Robin. And yes, there was a sapphic component to Wonder Woman. And yeah, there's something fascistic about a guy who can beat up, a strong man who can beat up on the ordinary people to get them to conform. Again, didn't start out that way. Was a very progressive figure. But as his powers increase, the people who are challenging him, they have to increase. But for a long time, look at the 50s Adventures of Superman show. Superman is just incredibly powerful, and goons, normal human goons, just throw themselves against him and try to shoot him with bullets, and he just rolls his eyes at them because his whole thing is, I exude power. I don't need to display power. I can do these things, and you are puny, puny humans against me. There is an undercurrent there, and there always has been.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
Could you just talk a little bit about the marketing? Because I feel like that's so important when you think about Superman and how you mentioned earlier, like being on cracker boxes or underwear, like things that you're like, why does this superhero need to be on underwear? But all things that are marketed toward kids, whether it's like a cereal or a TV show or, pick your piece of paraphernalia. I wonder how much of Superman's persona becomes this, it's almost like a Disney World or a Hollywood moment in which you have this superhero store, if you will. Like there's so much that you can sell that's Superman related. Was that always the intent to make it something bigger, or does it morph into something that becomes like, this huge, like, I don't know, capitalism monster in the way that everything is being marketed toward kids?
I mean, short answer, yes to all of that, but a long answer, look, Superman is a creature of comics, which means he is a character of visual iconography. That's a certain power. And to me, and I've talked about this many times, if I love Superman, I won't love every Superman story, but the visual iconography, the striking primary colored dude with the cape, there's always a primal power in that, because especially when you are reacting to it, many people go through that, and they see this character when they're kids before they can really read. Comics aren't illustrated text. They are a fusion of words and images. And if he was just his words, I don't think he'd have a stranglehold on the culture the way he does. I think you need that visual punch that he offers. And I think when you're talking about visual iconography, you're talking about logos, you're talking about something that is instantly recognizable and reproducible, and you can slap it on your own chest and say, I'm a piece of this character. I mean, as soon as this character leaves the comic book page, we all can get a piece of him. He enters the cultural consciousness. So my Superman might be the Kurt Swan-drawn Superman of the early 70s when I was growing up reading Superman. Or it might be Christopher Reeve, as it is for me. And to you, it might be Dean Cain, God help you. Or he could be anything. But we all have a facet of this character
is
that
Brandon
is ours.
Routh anyone's favorite?
Oh, well, give the guy a break. He tried. Like he was swimming against a tide there.
But Glenn, on coming back to this $130 check and Siegel and Schuster, do you think that the way that you've been describing how Superman has changed in the public imagination and has been positioned differently over the years and decades and eras, do you think that that's a product of the fact that the original creators lost some control? Did they watch Superman get sort of framed as a fascist and sit there going, gosh, if we had only if we had not sold the rights, we would have been able to sort of do something about this? What's your sense there?
By 1947, both of them were out the door. Their contracts were up. They were deeply disgruntled with DC Comics, which was, of course, National Allied Publications at the time. But they were deeply disgruntled because they felt that they had been screwed over, which they had. Siegel had created this idea of Superboy, Superman as a boy, and his editors rejected it. But then when he went off to fight in the war, they started publishing Superboy stories, and he didn't get anything from that. And, in his mind, Superboy is my character. To DC Comics' mind, it was just the same character, but as a boy, right? And this proceeded, this went on for a very long time. They eventually got a settlement, and then this all came to a head again because he had a suit against DC Comics, and this dragged on for decades. It came to a head in 1975 because what happened is a Warner Brothers lawyer reaches out to him out of the blue in 1975 to make his case against DC Comics, Warner Brothers go away. And Siegel knows why. Siegel knows that there's a movie in the works and that the movie cannot proceed until the suit is settled. He gets a very modest annual stipend. He and Schuster get a very modest annual stipend out of that, a settlement. Then a bit later, he reads that Warner's has sold the rights to Superman to the movie for $4 million, which 1975 money. Yeah. So he gets mad, as you do, and he writes this amazing, blistering 10-page single-spaced screed. He sends it to newspapers. He sends it to TV stations and radio stations across the country. It leads off with, Jerry Siegel, the co-creator of Superman, put a curse on the Superman movie, which is it's a good lead. As leads go, it's a good lead.
Yeah.
I need some editing to fit on the op-ed page.
I know, right?
The 10 pages single space does not get in there. So what happens is a couple of his fellow comics creators, really good guys, Neil Adams and Jerry Robinson, decide they're going to take the case to the people. They get the Cartoonists Guild involved. They get the Writers Guild involved. And eventually, Warner's agrees to give them each $20,000 a year for the rest of their lives, which is a drop in the bucket. But at this point, both of them are kind of broke. Both of them are, they're much older. They're worried about their health. But mostly what happens is they get credit on from that day forward, on every piece of Superman property. It would read Superman created by Jerry Siegel and Jerome Schuster. Credit matters to creators. Credit means your name lives on after you do. And, I think, generally speaking, creators who create something for a corporation that proceeds to market it and, exploit it and use it and do whatever they want with it, as you say, Jody. They want compensation for it, but they also want credit because corporations will reluctantly offer compensation because that's a one-time thing. But they will throw teams of lawyers at you to keep them from giving you credit because credit means they are locked into offering you royalties forever, which is something corporations live to avoid. And I don't think it's Pollyanna to say that credit means that their names will live on after them. Both Jerry and Joe are gone, but their creation isn't, and their names aren't. And that matters, I think.
There's a reason Stan Lee was cameoing in all of those movies.
He knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I was thinking about Stan Lee, who is in all those Marvel movies. Is that the best version of what could have happened for Siegel and Schuster, that they both get to cash in as these things become billion-dollar properties, but then also just become sort of icons and figures of their own?
Yeah, but eventually look what happened to Stan Lee. He eventually got screwed because he gave up. He gave up, right? Or he got sued out of existence by these giant corporations who have teams and teams of lawyers that you don't. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, any creator wants credit because that means that their name lives on. Even people who just come along, comics creators who will just, somebody who has a tenure on Superman today knows that all they're going to be able to do is go to the corporate toy box, pick up the Superman action figure, play with it for a few months or a few years, and then put it back in the toy box. And what they have to do is leave it unchanged because they are heavily licensed nuggets of intellectual property that resist change. And the job of a comics editor, at a big company like that is just to run interference and to ensure that the character stays recognizable and by that I mean licensable, so that the character will live on as it's always lived on. Creators know that that's their job, and if they're passionate about a character, they make their peace with it, but they know they're not going to make a lot of money on it, and this is why they go the creator-owned route when they want to tell their own stories. But in the 60s, when Stan Lee and Ditko and Kirby came along, they were a different kind of comic book creator, because the people, even though Stan Lee was back there in the original days of comics, mostly those guys were just churning out copy. They weren't passionate about these characters, right? Because this was their job. They just happened not to work in advertising, right? So this was their day job. They churned it out. And it showed in the work, because even as dynamic as some of these early comics were, you would never say that Superman had a different personality than Batman, right? Because they didn't have personalities. Mm-hmm. They were ciphers. And the only way you could tell them apart was by their powers and by their costumes. That changes with Lee and Ditko and Kirby, because then they invest them with not just personalities, but personality disorders to kind of make them relatable to the kids, to the adolescents who are reading them now. Yeah. And then in the 60s and 70s, what happens is you get this whole new generation of creators who grew up on these characters and love them unreservedly and are only too well prepared to get screwed over because they get to write they get to write Superman, they get to write Batman, they get to draw Superman, and that's what these corporations are kind of exploiting.
Wow.
Well, Glenn, this has been incredible. And I'm trying to think of a takeaway question to ask or piece of advice, but I don't know. It's just like, if you're going to make the next Superman, don't sell it for $100. I don't know.
You either want compensation or you want credit. Yeah. Ideally both, but both is not attainable.
Ideally both. And also enter any room with this. This is the super strip of all time. Just go within to any room with that vibe. Yeah, and it won't happen, but it might.
Yeah. All right, final question for you. So I mentioned at the top that the actual check for $130, the piece of paper, was sold for $160,000. You don't happen to know who bought that, right? It was anonymous. But
no, I have no idea. But man,
okay. I'd like to find out.
I have some guesses. They rhyme with Bicolus Beige, but I don't know. That's just a guess.
Interesting. All right,
we'll work on cracking that code.
All right. Well, Glen Weldon of NPR and author of Superman, the Unauthorized Biography. This has been really great. Thank you so much for doing this. And come back anytime you want to talk about comic books or anything else pop culture. But we really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Will do. Had a blast. Thanks, guys.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Mardovich, executive producer. Yuri Lasordo, director of operations. Thanks to all of you who support this show by being members of Radiotopia. Find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find us on social, suggest topics, all that and more at our website, thisdaypod.com. See you soon.
Radiotopia from